top-of-the-line smartphone, opening the box and finding nothing but a fancy certificate promising delivery at some undefined point in the future. That is exactly what North American diplomacy has looked like over the last few years. Politicians in Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City absolutely loved signing memorandums about eternal friendship and economic ecstasy. The USMCA trade agreement, which replaced the old NAFTA, was presented as the ultimate crowning achievement. It was hailed as a triumph of bureaucratic genius, complete with tons of official paper and endless smiles for the cameras. But by 2026, a harsh reality set in. Beautiful promises don't generate megawatts, they don't purify water, and they certainly don't move real cargo across the border. This paper tiger of diplomacy was sound asleep while the real world was bursting at the seams. American and Canadian corporations were rushing to move their manufacturing out of Asia and closer to home, straight into sunny Mexico. They proudly called this process nearshoring. The plan seemed brilliant. Just build the factories right next door, save a fortune on logistics, and enjoy the profits. But the unforgiving laws of physics quickly brought these dreamers back down to earth. It turned out that running massive factories in the Mexican state of Nuevo León requires more than just pompous declarations. It requires basic electricity and a stable internet connection. And that is where things went horribly wrong. The Texas power grid, fiercely proud of its independence, started rolling out blackouts at the slightest hint of bad weather. Meanwhile, the Mexican power grids were worn to the breaking point and simply couldn't feed the massive appetite of these new industrial giants. Diplomats kept gathering for high-profile summits, drinking expensive coffee, and discussing the green energy transition. At the exact same time, the engineers actually working on the ground were going gray from sheer panic. All these grand agreements felt like trying to run a heavy next-generation video game on a rusty old calculator. It looked ambitious and beautiful on paper, but it completely failed in the field. The officials sitting in their comfortable offices genuinely believed that the world was run by legal paragraphs. They spent years arguing over tariffs on car parts and the exact labeling rules for milk. Yet they completely ignored the physical condition of the actual communication channels. Chambers of commerce happily reported massive boosts in trade volume, while the physical infrastructure was essentially running on hopes and prayers. This bubble of illusions was bound to pop from the slightest breeze. And when it finally popped, it played out like a scene from a Hollywood disaster movie. Everything changed on a completely unremarkable Tuesday along the dusty border between Texas and Mexico. An ordinary excavator digging a standard trench near El Paso accidentally sliced through an inconspicuous, armored underground cable. This specific wire was never mentioned in the triumphant speeches of world leaders. It never appeared in the lengthy annexes of international trade agreements. But this exact cable was the lifeline tying together digital customs systems, massive logistics hubs, and the servers of the biggest auto plants on both sides of the border. In a fraction of a second, a colossal transnational machine just switched off. Thousands of massive trucks froze in gridlock. Assembly lines in Detroit and Monterrey completely halted because they simply ran out of parts. The screens of customs officers instantly started flashing a frantic warning red. A single movement of an excavator bucket proved one terrifying point. All this trilateral integration without actual physical wires is just expensive spam sitting in your inbox. And while lawyers frantically searched for the right clauses in their contracts, the real world stood frozen. It was waiting for an answer to a very simple question. How do you keep living when paper can no longer keep the lights on? Forget the tailored suits, the exquisite banquets, and the diplomatic notes gathering dust in the archives. In 2026, real geopolitics doesn't smell like expensive cologne. It smells like melting rosin, cheap vending machine coffee, and scorching hot metal. Welcome to an era where the fate of the White House isn't decided on Capitol Hill, but in the dusty industrial outskirts of Montreal. It all started when the world realized a very simple truth. Shipping microchips across a raging ocean is basically playing Russian roulette with global logistics. That realization gave birth to the project of the Great Merger. It transformed the border between the United States and Mexico into a single, pulsating nervous system. This isn't just a partnership anymore. It is a full-blown infrastructure marriage of convenience. Instead of wedding rings, the newlyweds exchanged high-voltage cables and semiconductor corridors. A unified power grid linked Texan wind turbines directly to Mexican factories. It created a closed loop that is literally impossible to break without triggering a catastrophic meltdown for both sides. If the lights even flicker in Austin, an assembly line in Monterrey building highly complex self-driving car chips stalls for a split second. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Picture an ordinary guy named Carlos. He works at an ultra-modern factory in the state of Nuevo León. Carlos doesn't wear a tie. He's terrible at small talk, and he couldn't care less about who the senators from Pennsylvania or Michigan are. But today, Carlos is holding the invisible remote control to the American elections right in his hands. How does that work? It is just the simple math of the global shortage era. An average voter in Ohio gets incredibly angry when they can't buy a new pickup truck because the electronics are delayed. That delay angers the auto giants, who immediately start slashing jobs. The economy goes into a nosedive. The ruling party's approval ratings plummet into the abyss, and the presidential candidate starts nervously popping sedatives. Now, imagine that Carlos and his co-workers decide to go on strike, or simply demand a raise, blocking the shipment of silicon wafers for just 3 days. The result? A total collapse of the supply chain, absolute panic on the stock market, and a guaranteed defeat for the current Washington administration in the next election. Not a single lobbyist with $1 million budget could trigger the kind of tectonic shift in voters' minds that a regular factory shift in Monterrey can cause just by taking a slightly longer tea break. This new symbiosis is called the Iron Triangle. Steel, microchips, and electricity have completely replaced good old-fashioned diplomacy. Presidents used to sign glamorous declarations of friendship. Now, they frantically monitor the bandwidth of cross-border data cables. Mexico has transformed from a convenient neighbor with cheap labor into the ultimate guarantor of a superpower's national security. The grand irony here is almost poetic. The very borders where they spent years trying to build massive walls ended up wrapped in ultra-fast internet fibers and power lines. They stitched the two nations together into one indivisible, breathing organism. But what happens if this flawless technogenic symphony breaks down? Not because of a strike, but because of the people who actually control the power supply. After all, the main switch for this giant resource vacuum isn't located in the White House. It isn't in Carlos's hands, either. The true master of the situation sits quietly in the shadows. They are watching as two massive nations slowly tighten a loop of dependency around their own necks, just hoping the current never runs dry. Imagine deciding to finally divorce your neighbor, only to realize your apartments share the exact same blood vessels. And to make matters worse, the power button for your refrigerator is sitting right next to their bed. That is exactly what North American geopolitics looks like right now. 95 in Canada, the United States, and Mexico aren't held together by inspirational speeches. They are bound by millions of miles of fiber optics buried deep underground. This union is stronger than any marriage. Trying to tear it apart is basically a guarantee of collective suicide, broadcast live for the world to see. While the leaders of the three countries bicker over tariffs, a single digital organism pulses silently right beneath their feet. Ultra-high-speed data highways have turned the entire continent into a massive communal apartment. You literally cannot slam a door without sending a shockwave through the entire network. If Washington ever decides to electronically isolate Mexico City, the American financial system will go completely blind within a second. That isn't a dramatic exaggeration. It is just the pure, unbreakable physics of silicon and glass. The speed of light traveling through quartz fiber dictates its own laws, and those laws do not care about executive orders from the White House. But the most elegant paradox of this entire technological web is hiding up north in the Canadian province of Quebec. 95. Right there, surrounded by endless forests and powered by the cheap energy of local rivers, beats the digital heart of Mexican national security. Mexico City literally keeps the backup copies of its most critical state registries, emergency service databases, and even its city traffic control systems on servers located in Montreal. Why on earth would they move their deepest state secrets so far north? The answer is brilliantly simple. Quebec is freezing cold, the electricity is incredibly cheap, and the local hydropower makes these data centers completely immune to energy crises. It is the perfect digital vault. Down there, the data won't melt in the heat, and it won't vanish during a rolling blackout. And this is where a kind of geopolitical magic kicks in, completely bypassing the US State Department. If a massive trade war suddenly erupts between Washington and Mexico City, the Americans physically cannot cut off the South's access to the cloud. The routing architecture is built in a way that traffic traveling from Quebec down to Mexico moves straight through the transit cables hardwired into the US East Coast infrastructure. Any attempt to selectively block those Mexican data packets would instantly crash the cloud services of New York, Boston, and Chicago. Information packets don't carry passports. They fly through the cables in one massive, continuous stream. The absolute top-secret files of the Mexican government are packed into the exact same optical pulses as the split-second financial transactions of Wall Street. You simply cannot filter out someone else's traffic without risking a catastrophic digital heart attack for your own economy. Those Canadian server farms have become an unbreakable shield for Mexican national security. Washington is now forced to fiercely protect and maintain the cables carrying Mexican data right across its own territory. They have to do it just to avoid sending their own financial sector back to the Stone Age. In the darkness, three major capitals find themselves locked in a permanent standoff. Quebec is the silent keeper of the keys. Mexico City is the ultimate beneficiary. And Washington is a hostage to its own geography. The fiber-optic curtain has fallen, but instead of dividing the continent with barriers, it stitched it together with microscopic threads of liquid glass. And now, any politician brave enough to try and cut that seam will very quickly realize they are holding a live wire pumping 1,000,000 volts. For a very long time, humanity honestly believed that the world was ruled by slick presentations, digital startups, and virtual promises. But by 2026, the universe politely reminded us of something crucial. You cannot heat a freezing house with blockchain. And you certainly can't build a protective missile dome out of social media likes. Welcome to the era of brutal, almost physiological pragmatism. Diplomacy finally took off its white gloves and put on a heavy construction hard hat. Today, the strongest arguments at the international negotiating table aren't abstract declarations of intent. They are highly tangible things. Millions of tons of steel, massive lithium deposits, sprawling nickel mines, and, of course, silicon. Silicon is the new oil. It is the new blood and the new brain of human civilization. The alliance between heavy industry and high technology, between steel and silicon, has become the new global religion. This isn't just a temporary fling to survive a bad year. It is a long-term marriage of convenience that will strictly define the geopolitical map for decades to come. The logic here is as simple and ruthless as the laws of thermodynamics. Steel gives you physical strength, a rigid framework, and brute protection. Silicon gives you absolute control, lightning-fast reactions, and pure intellect. If you only have steel, you are just a slow, clumsy pile of metal stuck in the 19th century. If you only have silicon, you are a genius brain floating without a body, completely defenseless against the harsh elements of the real world. The nations that figured out this simple truth first are now dictating the rules to the rest of the planet. Instead of endless, exhausting debates about shared values, they sit down and sign strictly concrete deals. We give you an uninterrupted supply of rare earth metals, and you give us guaranteed quotas for next-generation microprocessors. It is purely transactional. Nothing personal. Essentially, the modern world has been forced to hit a hard factory reset, going back to the absolute basics where physical resources decide everything. It feels a lot like a brutal high school hierarchy. Suddenly, nobody cares about the popular kids who just talk. Everyone respects the quiet guy who holds the keys to the server room and owns the only working generator. But there is one massive vulnerability hidden inside this flawless system. This perfect humming machine only works without a hitch until the notorious human factor enters the game. The main question hanging over the next few years sounds genuinely alarming. Can this fiercely pragmatic alliance survive the ultimate stress test of another global crisis, especially if politicians decide to play the cheap populism card again? Because when an angry, shouting crowd gathers right outside your door, leaders are heavily tempted to completely throw economic logic out the window. It is always so much easier to point fingers at external enemies. It is easier to shout loud slogans and promise voters mountains of gold, all while ruthlessly smashing the incredibly fragile supply chains keeping them alive. If the politicians actually give in to that temptation and start spinning the massive wheel of populism, the fallout will be absolutely catastrophic. Cold, hard iron pragmatism simply does not forgive stupidity. You cannot magically fix a physical shortage of raw materials or silicon chips by printing fresh paper money or typing out furious posts online. If the massive factories suddenly stop grinding, our entire fragile virtual world will vanish even faster, literally in a matter of seconds. Will cold, calculating logic be enough to keep the world from plunging straight into chaos? Or will human emotions once again prove stronger than common sense? We are going to find out the answer to that question very soon. Because the clock is ticking, and the time for easy compromises has almost completely run